He thought he was about to be left in a place where he would never be seen again, where loneliness would engulf him. His adopted son, whom he had raised with so much love, was taking him to an unknown place, until he discovered the truth. Have you ever felt abandoned by someone you loved deeply? Imagine, then, what it's like to be at an advanced age, not knowing whether your children will take care of you or leave you in a cold, distant and isolated place. What happened to Mr. Carlos, an elderly man who thought his adopted son was taking him to a nursing home, is a story that can break your heart. And what happened next is something he could never have imagined. Mr. Carlos had already begun to realize that his life was changing. Retirement had been a quiet time at first. He spent his first few years after leaving work in peace, tending to his garden and watching television, just like any old man would. But old age gradually took away more and more of the things he loved. His energy began to wane. Tiredness became more constant, and small falls, which were once rare accidents, began to happen with alarming frequency. He no longer had the agility to get up from his chair or walk without leaning on the walls. Mr. Carlos knew his body was getting old, but something still bothered him more than the pain in his knee or the muscles that no longer responded as he wanted them to. Fear. The fear of being left behind. Loneliness had been his most constant companion recently. He had gotten used to the idea that his children already had their own lives, but he couldn't deny the pain of no longer being a priority. His children grew up, got married and went their own ways. João, his adopted son, was always an exception. He was the son he felt he would never abandon. When João was still a child, Mr. Carlos was the pillar that supported him. Even when João's mother died, Mr. Carlos never hesitated. He welcomed him into his home with all the love he could muster. As a father, he felt there was nothing more important than giving the boy a life full of support, love, and security. For many years, João was his constant companion, his right-hand man at all times. Mr. Carlos never felt alone as long as João was around. But as the years went by, João's behavior began to change. What used to be frequent visits became more sparse encounters. João, the son Carlos felt would always be there, seemed to be drifting away. The phone calls became less frequent and the meetings shorter and shorter. Mr. Carlos tried not to show that he noticed, but he couldn't help noticing the growing distance between them. In those lonely days, he began to wonder what could be going on. Perhaps it was the fatigue of adult life. Perhaps João was so immersed in his own world that he had no time for his father. But fear began to creep into his mind. What if he was losing the bond with his adopted son? What if John was just waiting for him to go so he could get on with his life? These weren't just vague thoughts. Mr. Carlos sensed that something wasn't right. That's when João appeared, for the first time in weeks, with a strange expression on his face. His tone of voice was low, and his demeanor, normally so welcoming, seemed distant. He arrived at Carlos' house and, after a brief chat about the weather and his health, he dropped a bombshell. "Dad," João began, "I need you to walk me somewhere." Mr. Carlos, confused, just looked at him. "What place?" he asked. João hesitated for a moment before continuing. "It's a place where you can rest, improve your health. I'll help you, it'll be good for you." But instead of feeling relieved at the news that João was concerned about his health, Carlos' heart raced. Something didn't seem right. He had seen this behavior before, the kind of evasiveness that indicated John was hiding something. The kind of thing you do when you're trying to protect someone from the pain of the truth. "What do you mean, rest?" Carlos asked, his voice trembling with anxiety. João, trying to avoid looking his father in the eye, replied with a forced smile. "It's a recovery center, Dad. It'll be good for you." Joao's words echoed in Carlos' mind like a hammer hitting his head. A recovery center? What did that mean? Why was Joao acting like this? Something was wrong. The truth began to form in Carlos' mind, but he refused to believe it. He tried to understand. Perhaps Joao was just being cautious. Perhaps he wanted to avoid hurting him. But as the day of the trip drew closer, the fear became stronger, more palpable. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt that something very painful was about to happen. Something he didn't want to face. Mr. Carlos knew he was getting old, but he didn't want to be a burden to anyone. He didn't want to be that old man that his children feel obliged to look after, the one who is left out in a corner, where no one visits him, where no one listens to him. But doubt began to creep into his mind. What if this was exactly what was happening to him? Deep down, Carlos wanted to believe that John was doing this for him, that he wanted him to be well. But with each passing day, his heart grew tighter. As much as he tried to hide it, he couldn't help it. He knew, deep down, that John was taking him to a place where he didn't want to be, where he would probably never see his home again, nor his friends, nor the life he loved. He was being taken to a place where time seemed to stand still, where he would be just another face among others, a body to be cared for, where the world he knew would disintegrate in silence. Fear, loneliness, and the pain of a future without answers consumed him. But the last conversation between the two was like a beam of light in the darkness. Joao sat down next to Carlos, his face more serious than ever. He put his hand over his adoptive father's and, for the first time, looked him in the eye. "Dad, I don't want to lose you," said Joao, his eyes full of tears. "I know you don't understand now, but I'm doing this for you. I love you, and I'll never leave you." But despite hearing those words, Carlos still couldn't understand. What was going on? Why was he being taken to an unknown place, without knowing what awaited him? It was impossible not to feel that he was about to be left behind, in a way he had never imagined possible. And deep down, Carlos knew that this would be one of the greatest proofs of love that John could ever give him. The day of the trip arrived more quickly than Carlos had imagined. Joao showed up at his door first thing in the morning, as promised, with a gentle smile on his face. But Carlos could sense that Joao's smile was more strained than usual, as if he was trying to hide something. "Come on, Dad, it's only a few hours' trip. It'll be good for you," said Joao, trying to disguise the concern in his voice. Carlos, despite the knot in his stomach, accepted the trip without question. What else could he do? He was an old man, and Joao, as always, seemed to be doing his best for him. But the weight of doubt never left his mind. During the journey, Carlos sat still, watching the scenery from the car window, but his mind was far away. He tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was Joao so eager to take him to this recovery center? What wasn't he saying? Every kilometer, Carlos felt that something wasn't right, but he couldn't figure out what. He looked at Joao, trying to see any sign of truth in his adopted son's gaze, but Joao was so focused on the road that he barely looked at him. The tension in the car was palpable. Joao, always so open, now seemed closed off, distant. Carlos felt as if an invisible barrier had formed between them, a wall of silence and unspoken words. After hours of driving, they reached a small town, remote and quiet. Carlos noticed that the road leading to the institution was isolated, with few buildings around. He felt his heart beating faster. Something was very wrong. Joao was no longer smiling, but his expression was so focused and serious that Carlos had the feeling that his son was trying to protect something, or someone. When they entered the building, a feeling of coldness came over Carlos. The place was silent, except for the footsteps echoing in the wide, empty premises. "Here we are, Dad," said João, finally looking at him with an expression that mixed guilt and concern. Carlos followed João through the cold corridors, his mind racing, wondering what was going on. He observed the nurses and staff who seemed so distant, so indifferent, as if they were used to seeing elderly people arriving, ready to be left behind. He could feel an uncomfortable presence in every corner, a heaviness in the air. And then John finally stopped in front of a door. "This is where you're staying, Dad. It's only for a while. It'll be good for you. It'll improve your health." Carlos stood paralyzed in front of the door. Something inside him screamed at him not to go in. He didn't know exactly what was going on, but everything inside him told him that he shouldn't be there. Panic began to take over his body. "João, what are you doing? I don't want to stay here." "I can't," Carlos' voice broke, full of fear. João looked at him with a sad but resolute expression. "I know it's hard, Dad, but you need this. They'll look after you here. You'll see, you'll feel better." But that didn't make sense to Carlos. He felt like he was being abandoned, left behind in a place that was more like a prison than a recovery center. His heart squeezed with the pain of loneliness that was beginning to take hold of him. He didn't want to stay there. He didn't want to be the old man forgotten, ignored and cast aside by everyone, even John, the son he believed would never abandon him. He looked at John, his eyes full of tears, trying to find some trace of the son he had known. But João no longer looked the same. The young man Carlos had raised and loved, the one who had always promised to take care of him, now seemed like a stranger. Carlos felt a lump in his throat, a sense of helplessness. He felt like he was being betrayed, as if everything he had done for João had been in vain. The fear of being left alone in the world was taking hold of him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Before he could protest further, João slowly walked away, avoiding his father's gaze. "I'll be back soon, Dad. I promise I'll be back," he said, his voice full of regret. But for Carlos, these words meant nothing. He wanted João to stay there with him, not to leave him alone in a place where he felt like a burden to others, where he was just another number. He wanted to scream, but his strength seemed to have disappeared. He stood there, in a strange cold place, not knowing what to do or where to go. The doors closed behind João, and Carlos stood there, alone, feeling like a shadow of his former self. He knew that, no matter how hard he tried, he would never be the same again. The pain of loneliness enveloped him like a dark cloak, and he felt older and more powerless than ever. But deep down, what hurt him most was not the place, nor the distance from João, but the feeling of abandonment. The feeling that he had been discarded. The fear that, at some point, everyone would forget him and he would become just a distant, worthless memory. As he walked through the cold corridors of that place, Carlos wondered what he had done wrong. Had he failed as a father? Did João just see him as a burden? He knew that time was running out, and he didn't have much more time to change things. But something inside him still resisted, something that said that, perhaps, he could change his story, that he could still recover what he had lost. And then, without realizing it, a surge of hope ignited inside Carlos. Maybe life wasn't over for him yet. Maybe, just maybe, he could still be more than just a forgotten old man. It was in this moment of vulnerability, of pain, of disconnection with his son, that something much greater began to reveal itself to him. What seemed like the end of his journey could actually be the beginning of a profound transformation. And as he walked through the lonely walls of that center, a persistent question began to form in Carlos' mind. What would he do now? Time passed slowly for Carlos. Every day, he felt more lost, more empty. The first few weeks at the center were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The loneliness was overwhelming. The place, far from being the paradise John had promised, seemed like a space where older people were just a number. The nurses and staff treated the residents with coldness and indifference. Some of the elderly seemed resigned, others were lost in their own worlds. But the worst thing for Carlos was the lack of interaction, of affection, of any trace of life outside his own memories. He didn't want to be there, but he felt powerless, as if he had already lost his voice and his importance. But it was on a particularly gray morning, while looking out of the window of his small room, that something unexpected happened. For weeks, Carlos had become accustomed to the distant sound of the other residents' footsteps, but that day seemed different. The door to his room slowly opened and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was João, but he didn't look the same. There was something on his face, a mixture of tension and guilt, as if he were carrying an unbearable weight. Carlos' heart leapt. What would he do now? What did João have to say after all this time with no news? João walked in without saying a word and sat down in the chair next to Carlos' bed. The silence between them was oppressive, as if there was an immense chasm between the two souls. Carlos felt the anger and pain building up inside him, but he couldn't find the right words to express what he was feeling. After a moment, João finally looked into his father's eyes. "Dad, I don't know where to start," he said, his voice trembling. Carlos stared at him, feeling a knot forming in his throat. He wanted to scream, to ask what John was doing, why he had abandoned him like that. But instead, a wave of sadness washed over him. He was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of feeling invisible. And then John did what Charles would never have expected. With a heavy sigh, he took a sheet of paper out of his bag and placed it in front of Carlos. "I didn't want you to know like this, Dad. But I have to tell you the truth. I can't lie to you anymore." Carlos looked at the paper, his heart beating faster, but a cold sensation ran down his spine. What could that be? A goodbye letter? An empty explanation? John continued, his voice now full of regret. "I brought you here, Dad, because I didn't know what else to do. I saw you getting older, I saw your strength fading, and I panicked. I was afraid of losing you, but I was also afraid of not being enough to look after you. I wanted you to have the best possible treatment, because you deserve it. I didn't know how to do that without hurting you, and the only option I found was this center, but it wasn't what I really wanted." Carlos looked at João, his eyes now watering. He felt a mixture of anger, hurt, and deep sadness. All he wanted was for João to look him in the eye, to see him as a human being, not as a burden. He wanted John to know that he wasn't looking for a hospital, a recovery center. He just wanted love, affection, and the certainty that he wouldn't be left behind. But at the same time, Carlos could feel the pain on João's face. He was as lost as he was, as desperate to find a solution that wouldn't hurt anyone. "I know, Dad. I know I did everything wrong. I shouldn't have brought you here. I wanted you to stay with me so much. But I was so afraid of losing you that I ended up doing the wrong thing. I was trying to protect you, but I ended up pushing you further away." João spoke with raw sincerity, and Carlos realized, for the first time, the weight of guilt that João was carrying. Perhaps he wasn't trying to get rid of it, but to fight the fear of not being able to take care of the man who had always been his father figure. The revelation was a punch in the gut for Carlos. He felt torn between relief and pain. Relief, because he now knew that John hadn't abandoned him out of selfishness, but out of fear. Pain, because that didn't change the fact that he was there, alone, in a place that felt more like abandonment than a solution. But at the same time, something began to change inside him. He was no longer alone. The truth had been told, and somehow he felt that John was trying to right the wrong, even if it was too late. Carlos looked at his son, and for the first time, he didn't just see a man who had left him behind. He saw a son, someone who still cared about him, but who was also lost. In a gesture he would never have imagined, Carlos placed his hand on John's and said, his voice trembling but filled with a deep love, "I understand, son. I know you just wanted to help me. But I didn't need all this. I just wanted you to be by my side." The two were silent for a few moments, and something magical happened. The distance that had formed between them during those weeks apart began to disappear. It wasn't perfect. There were no magic solutions. But at that moment, Carlos and João found each other, in a way that they both needed. They were no longer two strangers living in the same space. They were father and son, and that meant more than any recovery center or health plan. When the conversation ended, João stood up and looked at Carlos with tear-filled eyes. "I'm going to take you home, Dad, where you should always be." And for the first time in a long time, Carlos believed his son's words. He didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, he knew he had what he had always wanted, João's love, the promise of being together again. And that, as simple as it was all he needed to move forward. The time he had spent at the center had not been in vain. He read between the lines of John's anguish. He realized that behind every gesture there was a son who was concerned about his father's well-being, but didn't know how to deal with his own insecurities. The real cure didn't lie in a place, but in the rebuilt bond, the honest look and the recognition of their vulnerability. João, for his part, knew he couldn't erase what had happened. But looking at Carlos at that moment, he understood that what matters most of all is genuine presence. They might have made a mistake along the way, but there was still time to fix it, to rebuild. The mistake wasn't in trying to help, but in the fear that made them make unthinking decisions. Life, with its ups and downs, taught them that what really matters are the bonds we form, the moments we share, the truth we are able to face together. When João helped Carlos leave the center and return to his home, it wasn't just a change of address. It was the renewal of a commitment to care for, support, and, above all, understand each other. Their journey had only just begun, but one thing was clear. Now, more than ever, they were ready to walk side by side, unafraid of imperfections, with the confidence that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Just for those of you who like a good story and watched it to the end, leave your comment below. I stayed until the end. And there's one more thing. An elderly man is ignored at a car dealership. The next day, he buys the company and fires the employees. That's the theme of the video I've pinned here. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.